Welcome to The Brain Factor, hosted by myself, Joy Riddle, and Laura Hawley. We're a part of Meridian Behavioral Healthcare, where we believe that wellness is within everyone's reach. This podcast is a conversation about what research-based protective factors look like in real life. Our hope is that you'll walk away with something that you can use in your own life and have had some fun with us along the way. So let's get started. Hey, welcome to The Brain Factor. We're so glad that you joined us again today. We've got a really special episode and a really special guest with us today. I read a book recently called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's about the impact of trauma on your body. So I discussed it with Laura, and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's so fascinating. You've got to read this. I don't know if she got to it yet or not, but we really thought there were some great points about trauma that we wanted to bring to everybody and share. But, I'm not really qualified to do that. Laura doesn't work in that area. So we have this really special guest with us today, Maggie Labarta, Dr. Maggie Labarta, who's a great friend and a great recently retired clinical psychologist with a really strong, impressive resume. Yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure. Super well qualified. So Maggie, I wanted to get your kind of input, not on the book. I'm not trying to do a book club episode or anything like that. But just thinking about trauma and how it impacts the body, it was really surprising to me, like how it can manifest itself in so many ways in the body that you don't even know is going on.
So thinking about trauma and what the implications are, trauma is a high stress situation, right? So if you think about all of the hormonal things that happen under stress, and your heart rate goes up and your arousal state goes up and your alertness goes up. So all of that is a physiological state that can become sort of semi-permanent and then has implications for your whole body. So think about stress. You breathe differently. You hold your muscles differently. Your pulse goes up. You're constantly on alert. You're very vigilant. So if you think about all of those physical reactions, depending on the kind of trauma, the intensity of the trauma, the duration of the trauma, those things can become sort of embedded in permanent states. And so a lot of folks that have had trauma, part of the work of therapy is not just understanding, but also kind of refeeling those things in your body and trying to figure out how to do it. So a lot of breathing kinds of things, just to kind of make your muscles and all of your systems come down, especially arousal, which is a big thing that you see in people who have extensive trauma.
That seems like what you're explaining to me on a very small scope. For me, it's kind of like when I'm planning an event or something, and it's this big thing and it's the full day, and I'm just like on and like at this level the entire time, and then at the end of it I'm like, oh my goodness, what just happened in the last 15 hours?
And the body is not designed to operate at that level all the time.
Go away. Maybe some people experiencing trauma.
That's my question, is I think that trauma has become, there's been such an increase in awareness in our society about trauma and the impacts of trauma. Folks like you and I who maybe don't have the same sort of set of experiences and education and knowledge base that you do, but we have this growing awareness that it's a thing. It's a thing that impacts people. It's a thing we have to be aware of. Based on what you were just describing, it sounds a lot like stress, right? So I guess where is that line? Like when is stress trauma, or is stress a version of trauma, right? What does that look like?
Right. So stress is a reaction to a somewhat more normative kind of event. In fact, there's lots of data that says you can perform better on a test. For example, a certain amount of anxiety going into a test is performance enhancing. But a certain level above that becomes not enhancing at all. It becomes actually counterproductive, right? So what you want, and I'm going to turn my phone off because it's consistently telling me every email that's buzzing through my system.
Causing you stress right now.
So a trauma, when you start to think about trauma in a clinical sense, you're talking about an event that is above and beyond the usual threshold for things that we consider stressful. So being yelled at by your boss is a stressor. If it happens all the time, that becomes a different level of experience, right? If it's a person who is close to you, parent, spouse, close relative, somebody in your household, and it's repeated and it's at a high level and it eats at you constantly, that then becomes trauma. And I think part of why we're more aware of trauma is because we've redefined it. If you think about it, what we now call PTSD and war veterans used to be battle fatigue, right? So we've come to define it differently. We've also understood, as we've looked at children, the myth of child resilience is something I wish people would get over. Yes, children are resilient to a point, but only under certain circumstances. And there is now awareness of something called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And that includes the environment in which you're growing up. It includes lack of support. It includes belittling. It includes all the way through to actual abuse. It includes parental unavailability because of substance abuse or those kinds of issues. So we understand that those things have long-lasting physiologic impacts as well as psychological ones. And so we've come to a better understanding of what is a trauma. And it's things that are damaging to the person physically, emotionally, and at a high or consistent, continuous level.
You talked about ACEs. Let's look a little bit more at childhood, because it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong or point me in the right direction, that when trauma is experienced in childhood, it has a bit of a different impact than if we experience it like at our age now, right? That kind of,
Sure.
What does that look like and why?
Well, there's two aspects to that, right? One is, as children, you're just beginning to develop coping strategies. So the less you are able to cope, the more impact it's going to have. And child development it's building blocks, right? So if I have trauma at a place where I'm just beginning to develop a sense of autonomy, and that trauma strips my autonomy, well, then it also strips me of the ability to be accountable, to self-regulate, right? And so regulating emotion is one of the biggest tasks of early childhood, the ability to soothe yourself. So all of those building blocks to resilience get stripped away. And children don't have words.
Right. Not like you and I do.
Right. Think about the nuanced feeling vocabulary of an adult compared to the feeling vocabulary of a child. So what do you do as a child? One of the things you do in kindergarten is you learn to use words, not your body, to communicate. We tell Johnny we're mad that because he hurt our feelings instead of whacking him or kicking him or fighting him. Right. Okay. So if you go in a kindergarten classroom, you'll hear, use your words a lot, right? And so then we have to store that and process that in words that are not verbal. And as adults, how does that memory come up? Well, not in words.
So that's how it shows up in body.
It shows up in body. And so it's not uncommon, for example, women who have had abuse that they have forgotten, they then get pregnant or enter a sexual relationship, and all of that resurfaces in ways that are very powerful physically. Anxiety, not being able to breathe, all kinds of things that manifest. And so the body stores what it can't process.
Okay. Yeah, and reading it can show up in so many different things, like in, obesity and all these different types of issues that people have, then go back to.
Yeah. And some things are, to your point about trauma is a word that gets thrown around a lot. Adverse experiences come in a range. I'll tell you, my family immigrated to this country when I was 6. We were fleeing Cuba, and my dad was in a very vulnerable place because he was opposed to Castro. And I was 6, so nobody was cluing me in because there were some real need to do it quietly and not, so the last thing you need to do something quietly is tell a 6-year-old.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So I was pretty unprepared for the fact that this was going to be a permanent arrangement. So in one fell swoop, I lost grandparents, aunts and uncles, all of the continuity in my life, and had entered an environment where I didn't even know the language. And years later, as an adult, I would go on a vacation trip, and I was incredibly anxious at the end of it. And coming home, I always used to, and I knew there was nothing wrong with my house, there was nothing going on, but I would come home with this the whole time trip home with all this anxiety. And my mother finally said to me one time, well, there was this one time when you left and didn't go back.
You think maybe that's an impact?
I'm a psychologist, and I sort of missed that one, right? Yeah. And so, I'm a pretty resilient person. I was fairly successful. It's not like this huge impact in my life, except I would come home from vacation trips with high anxiety, and I couldn't figure out what the deal was. There you go. It went away once I realized. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I love something you just said. You said, I'm a fairly successful person and I'm fairly resilient. It was just this one area, right? So talk about a little bit more about that. Like, how does trauma, what areas of life can trauma interrupt? And is it always, one or two that are related to that experience, or can it seep into other areas? How does this show up for people?
So it depends, right?
Okay.
And if it's an isolated event, it can be very narrowly triggered. Like with me, it was vacations did it, right? Driving to work did not. I did not try to, when I was driving home from work, I didn't think, oh my gosh, my house isn't going to be there. So it was very specific. And so you'll have people who have triggers that are very specific and reactions that are very specific. There are certain, if you've been in a bank robbery, going into banks is going to be, but going into restaurants may not be. If you've been a victim of ongoing abuse and it started very young, then many things can be triggering. For example, you've been a victim of domestic violence, or as a child, you've seen a lot of domestic violence. Being touched has a very different meaning to you, and that can then be in a huge range of situations. People who come back from extended periods of war. I think one of the concerns and one of the issues for our veterans coming back from the Iraq and Afghanistan has been the very long and the number of deployments, right? So the more the exposure, the likelier it is. The less resilient, the more already deficits in coping you have, the more likely it's to have a more pervasive impact, and the more things that are likely to be affected. So we can talk about how intrusive are the memories. Well, it depends, right? It can be triggered very specifically, or it can be triggered very generally if you've been exposed to a very big variety of abusive or violent situations. So intrusiveness, being re-triggered, all of those are vulnerabilities that are more related to the specific event. But then you have things like amnesia for the event, or you have disrupted sleep, you have hyperarousal, hypervigilance. If you've been robbed, walking down a street might be a different experience than if you've never, you had some other kind of trauma, like being in a hurricane or So it kind of can vary, and it can be very broad or very narrow.
I think that's really one of the things I saw when I was reading in the book. Like you said, you gave the example of a hurricane, which, okay, a lot of us, especially we're in Florida, can relate to a hurricane. And when the next one's coming, it's like, oh, it's coming. And I might tell you about the hurricane and what happened. But in the book, when I read it, it talked about the veterans and the PTSD when they were traumatized in that way over time. And one of the differences between those two scenarios that they laid out is, like, if I'm telling, and they didn't use a hurricane, but if I'm telling my story about what happened in the hurricane, every time I tell it to you, it's probably a little bit different. Same story, a little bit different. But with the veterans that were traumatized in war, they would speak with them, they tell a story, they tracked a number of them for like 10 years and then got the story again, and it was identical. They told the same story.
It becomes stuck in time. It just becomes a thing that is no longer malleable, right? I used to tell clinical staff all the time, therapy is about the telling of stories. And the whole goal of therapy is to change not so much the events, because you can't go back and change the things that happen, but how you tell a story is related to the valence, the emotional impact, the emotional intensity that you still attach to that story. And so the more intense, the less you're going to change it, the less it becomes modified with time, the less it becomes softer around the edges with time.
Oh, and it does.
It's still this very concrete, specific event.
And that's why you're seeing the same exact story 10 years later. Staying on that topic of veterans and combat veterans, when I worked in deployment cycle support, one of the things we saw that was always so intriguing to me, I'd love to learn more about the mechanics of why, right, is we would have, two service members who literally went through the exact same thing. And I don't mean like, oh, I experienced that on my deployment, you experienced that on yours. I mean, standing next to each other, experiencing the exact same thing and differently. One is having trouble with the coping and adaptability and returning to normal life, and one is processing that better and more effectively and is not having the same struggles. As you can imagine, there's a lot of stigma that comes along with that, a lot of perception of weakness, things like that, particularly in that world where the optics of strength is so important. So can you speak to sort of what happens there? And
Sure. So it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Coping strategies and development are building block based. So let's talk about the economy, right? If you start out with a lot of money, chances are you came out with a lot of money. If you started out with no money, you probably were even more adversely affected, right? So it's the same thing. Some of it is what you bring. Some people have a higher tolerance for pain, for stress, to begin with. They're just physiologically better that way, better equipped that way. Some people also have a better support system to deal with things. So you had a big repertoire of understanding that you're coming back to family, to a community, to a whole bunch of resources that this other person, internal or external resources that this other person may not have. And so we're going to process the same experience differently. Somebody who says hurricanes, if you grew up in South Florida, hurricanes were an excuse for a party. You go out to California where you have no warning for an earthquake. And so I know people who were very comfortable in hurricanes, but terrified of earthquakes. Well, why? Well, one person had experience with them and the other person didn't, right? So a lot depends on what you come into that situation with in terms of how you...
Okay. So your childhood development can have a large impact on it.
And your current environment. So if you think about protective factors in terms of trauma, there are individual ones which have to do with those things I was just talking about, just your physiology, your coping strategies, your level of development and experience. And then there are family protective factors which have to do with how much of a support system and how open the communication is, how positive those relationships are. And then there are community factors that have to do with, and the military, I think, is really struggling to figure out how to do this, how to support that person, how to do peer group support that can say, hey, you're not alone in this. You're not the only one who, here's a car backfires and is flat on the ground thinking it was a shell, So all of those things then can help. What are the resources the community is offering? Is there a peer group? Is there recognition and understanding at that level as well? And that's where all of this destigmatizing stuff is so important, right? Because it makes it something that the community says it's okay to talk about and explore.
I want to switch gears really quick, because you said something before the cameras were rolling. We were having a conversation, as we often do, and I think that our viewers and our listeners would benefit from hearing a little bit about what you were talking about with the cost benefit and why trauma behaviors and interruptions might show up later in life when it's been fine until now, right? Like, what does that look like?
So we all do things to cope with stress. There's a reason comfort food is called comfort food.
So well.
And so comfort food is comfortable and comforting until you're diabetic. Right? Yeah. So often symptoms that people present with in therapy, I'm not sleeping well, or suddenly my relationships, I realize that I've had all of these relationships that are no longer functional or no longer satisfying. And why is that? And then you realize, well, it's because I do or feel or experience these things, and I want to stop it. And I've had people come into therapy and say, okay, I just need to give this up because I can't keep doing this. It's ruining my life. And so today I'm stopping. And I'm like, well, let's slow down for half a minute, because you're obviously at some point, this was something that was helpful. It either provided comfort, it provided safety, it reduced a bad feeling. So before we give that up, we need to understand what it was doing, and not to punish yourself for continuing to use it, but clearly at one point it benefited you and the costs were minimal. It wasn't impacting your relationship, at least not in ways you could see or in ways that you thought were negative. Now the cost, the price you're paying for using that coping mechanism, either in terms of your physical health, your emotional health, or your relationships, is exceeding the benefit. Yeah, it's become unaffordable, or it just simply has stopped working. Sure. And so, blaming mom and dad works great until you're out on your own. So you got to give it up, right? But then you've got to figure out how can I become accountable? How do I take control? A lot of trauma is loss of control, right? You didn't know that hurricane was going to slam into your house. You didn't know that bullet was going to slam into your body. You didn't know, the abuse was going to leave you shaking and quaking anytime somebody came near you. So part of it is, how do you reestablish that control, that ability to self-regulate in ways that are healthier? And so that's what you see in trauma. And it's kind of, again, we talked about arousal and hyperarousability, fight, flight. So some people's coping strategies are fighting, some are fleeing, some are possum, play dead, just shut down, freeze. Mm-hmm. And some of it is just fawning, please the person coming, just constantly please people so they don't abuse you. You see this in domestic violence a lot, where the victim just does everything imaginable, but then that's what carries through to other relationships. So those are all behaviors that we engage in that then have a huge price to be paid.
I think that's a good segue to, we're getting the warning that we're out of time, but what I don't want to sign off today before learning how, for us and for our viewers and listeners, in our everyday life, in our jobs or in our families or in our friendships, what are some simple things that we can do to be more trauma informed, to be better at a better space for people to exist in when we may or may not know what they're bringing to the table?
I think that's awfully important, because war, hurricane, we know that you were robbed, your house was destroyed. We get that, right? We all know that people need to talk about that, and we're all going to rush and go, oh my gosh. When the trauma is more hidden, so it's like an emotional. So I think one of the biggest shifts that being trauma informed produced, it was a radical shift for behavioral health, and because behavioral health is part of healthcare, right? And so what do you do when you talk to your doctor? Well, what's wrong? Mm-hmm. Now it's, well, what's happened? Right. What's happened to you? Which opens up a very different conversation. So if somebody is acting in these sort of fight, flight, freeze modes, it's like, what's happened? As opposed to what's wrong? Because what's wrong is, what's wrong with you? What's bad about you? As opposed to what has happened to you. One of the things that people who've gone through trauma need is safety. And safety includes control of that, as much of that situation that they're in as possible. So don't touch me unless I invite you to, right? Don't push for information unless I tell them I'm sort of trying to be ready to give it up. People have to be trustworthy and transparent. Lie once and you've lost that person. Right? They're very picky about those kinds of things because it, again, doesn't feel safe if somebody does not operate with you in a fully honest, fully transparent way. Empowerment, which is part of how you gain control. You decide what the steps are. You decide what you're ready for. Peer support. You're not alone, right? Listening, with humility and respect, for understanding that one person may have gone through this, to your point earlier, and been okay, but I'm not. I have a different background. I have a different history.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things are important. That all of us can do that, right?
Sure.
All of us can do that. But it's really critically important that those be part of the therapeutic environment as well when somebody comes in and asks for help in that regard.
Excellent. Well, I can't thank you enough for being here. I think it's the quietest we've ever been. I know, we're just like, tell us more. Yeah. Like, tell us more, teach us more. But if you are struggling, if trauma has resurfaced for you, or your coping strategies that have worked up until now are suddenly costing too much or no longer effective, there are resources to reach out. We'll put the number on the bottom of the screen for Meridian. It's a great place to start in North Central Florida. And you're not alone, as we heard here today from Dr. Labarta. Thank you so much for...
Thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation. I think it's an important one, so thanks.
No, thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Brain Factor. Joy and I are so thrilled to be having these needed conversations. We'd love to hear your feedback on this episode, so if you could drop a comment or leave a review with your thoughts or any requests that you may have, it would be appreciated. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Living a healthier and happier life starts with one step, and we're excited to be on this journey with you. Until next time.